We have a great, exciting day today. We will start off with RA4, Research Area 4, Biogeochemical Cycles and Climate. We will then have a short introduction or presentation of the Bolin Center database, and then there will be FICA. We will have a database help desk. Database is about that we want you to put your data into the database, which can be sometimes a bit, sometimes people need a little push. And you will get the reward if you do that. We have a booth for the mentoring program and also the modeling coordinators and of course the posters from yesterday. And after the FICA, we have a session from the ESAC, and I really encourage everyone to stay so that we can listen to what our new ESAC is doing when they're not advising centers, but when they're doing their research. Okay, and with that, I'll leave the floor to Christian, who will chair the session for RA4.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. My name is Christian Beer. Nice to see so many of you this morning. I'm one of the co-leaders of Research Area 4, together with Volker and Gustav. I'm also happy to announce that Gustav is a new Research Area co-leader here, although unfortunately cannot be here. I will share the session and we will hear some words from what has been achieved, some examples from Volker. Start with that, and then we continue with some detailed presentations after that. So Volker, the floor is yours.
Dedicated biogeochemists here, that's nice to see. All of you biogeochemists. And so RA4 on biogeochemical cycles and climate, I show this only very briefly, has three major focal areas, and most of it circles around the carbon cycle. But I'll tell you that we're expanding into other elements of the periodic table as well. The three focal areas are quantifying as best as we can the reactive pools in the carbon cycle. We do this by a variety of methods. The second one is that we want to understand the fluxes and the exchange of these carbon pools in terrestrial and marine systems, or biomes we call them. And last but not least, we want to understand the mechanisms in the regulation of this carbon exchange. All of this is done by a broad variety of methodologies, ranging from field observations, experiments, genetic methods. Importantly is also scaling approaches and various modeling approaches. Before we get into what we have been doing this year, as opposed to last year, we have regularly several, up to 4 or 5 small projects, well, small or not, they last between a year and 2 years, that we support from the funds that we have within RA4. And the most recent project that we have supported is a collaboration with RA1 on atmospheric pathways to improve seasonal predictability of the terrestrial carbon cycle. This one is headed by Gabriel Messori from MISU, but with collaborators also at ACES and IGV and NG. Second one is an example of how we're trying to sort of use other elements, nutrients, that are directly coupled to the carbon cycle and that have large implications for alkalinity and CO2 balances in the marine environment. And this is a work by Zhao Sun on silicon isotope use in the marine environment. We're also doing some more exotic work, such as, for example, the formation of very labile calcium carbonate minerals. One of them is the ikaite mineral, which is a very easily precipitated calcite mineral at very low temperatures and can be very, very important for subsurface storage of CO2. And then finally, we are also funding, of course, work in the terrestrial carbon reel, and this is work that is currently supported to Christian Beer in supporting 14C analysis and in relation to cryoturbation, which we're going to hear about more later. Now, as part of our funding theme within RA4, we decided 2 years ago that we wanted to sort of pool the available funds such that we a substantial amount of our annual support to a single project, and one of that was a project given to Stefano Manzoni, and with multiple collaborators also at SLU and South Bohemia and Czech Republic and Canada. And this project is called the Carbon Use Efficiency Across Scales. And it addresses one of the most important problems in the carbon cycle that I'll be getting into a little more. That is, how do we actually scale observations that are at the organismal level all the way up to the ecosystem level? And how this is very, very important if we want to understand the mechanistic studies and the rates and the size of these that we measure at the very small scale, and then have this bottom-up approach to a very large ecosystem scale. So how do we do this best? And a conceptual approach here is devised in this carbon use efficiency concept, which essentially says how much of the carbon that is available as a source actually makes it into an organism and how much gets lost. And how does this proportion actually vary as a function of nutrient availability? How nutrient-starved the system is or how nutrient-rich a system is actually affects what the stoichiometry of that organism is. And this is very important for work that Filippa will be presenting, that also has been presented yesterday with Bolin et al. But this is an ecological theory approach to that. Now, the first results that are currently being written up by Stefano point to the fact that the field observation, this is what you see here on a nice logarithmic plot where you hide, well, you can't even hide it there, and it shows actually what ecological theory should predict, that the more nutrient-starved a system gets, the less carbon it takes up, because it must follow a certain biochemical CN demand. And therefore, you're taking up less and less carbon the more a nutrient-starved the system becomes. Now, if one applies this concept to various ecosystems, from the leaf, here on the top left side, to the canopy, one sees strong variability in carbon use efficiency. And on the right to that, you see for the ecosystem carbon use efficiency, you actually see, oh, that was bad. I'll leave it for now. You see that ecosystems as a whole in general have lower carbon use efficiency. In particular, aquatic ecosystems have distinctly lower carbon use efficiency. So the idea is now that we're going to synthesize this particular work and want to apply it further to various terrestrial and marine ecosystems. There were a few highlights this year, and I'm just going to show a few of those. This is a work that was published just recently by Charlie Coven, Gustav Hugelius, our new chair leader in Nature Climate Change, and it addresses the issue of carbon turnover time in soil, of soil carbon, global soil carbon. What this work in particularly shows is that one uses the very, very large soil carbon database that is also the Arctic soil carbon database that is managed here at NG, and one couples this with particular climate models in order to predict what the turnover time of this carbon pool is as a function of mean air temperature. And so these are model results that try to predict what the turnover time of this carbon pool is as a function of the mean air temperature. And you see this also here on the right side. Now, one thing that is worth pointing out here, in the climate models that the CMAP5 generation climate models that are used for the IPCC report, they would not be able to actually recreate this temperature sensitivity pattern of the soil carbon. What is actually important in these new models that you see on the right side is that they have a specific depth-resolved soil respiration function in it that actually takes not only into account of oxygen concentration, of moisture, but also on the reactivity of the organic matter that you have in the soil. And the previous models that were particularly used in the CMAP5 generation did not have this particular depth-resolved function in it and could actually not correctly represent the reactivity of the soil carbon pool globally. So this is a significant progress. Along similar lines of trying to sort of address the question of soil carbon turnover rate or turnover time. Now, the turnover rate that I'm showing here is a publication by Martin Turner, and I'm going to show a second one follow-up from 2017. That is, in this case, actually using satellite data. These are radar-derived data from Envisat data that try to sort of assess the vegetation carbon stock globally in boreal forests. And you see here in these four panels, you see examples from Canada, Western Russia, Siberia, and Central Siberia, and Eastern Siberia. And all of those are actually plotted in a south to north transect, which also reflects the number of icing days. Now, what I want to point out to you here is actually something that may be a little counterintuitive, in that actually the soil carbon turnover rate, that is, the faster the carbon in the soil turns over is, the more icing days you actually have, i.e., in other words, the colder it is because you have more icing days. So your turnover increases the colder it is. Now that is, a priori, would be counterintuitive, but it points to something that is also not in current vegetation models, that at least that is the interpretation, that the frost damage that incurs to plants actually makes them on the long term more labile, and there you have a faster turnover of this carbon biomass. And so this is actually the map, the inventory carbon stock map that this is based on, and these red quadrangles show you where these particular regions were actually depicted. And again, one thing that is worth pointing out, if one designs a climate model and looks at the carbon turnover rate, so these were the inferred linear regressions that I showed you previously, and compares these to the existing climate models, you see that there's actually a relatively poor fit. So these dynamic global vegetation models lack very important parameters that have, for example, something to do with mortality, and this needs to be addressed better. So finally, methane, of course, has been in the center of a lot of work here in the Bolin Center, and partly related to the submarine permafrost methane idea that has been looked at for several years now. But we've also had a very, very strong methane group up working in northern Sweden. This is the group of Patrick Krill. Now, this is a recent commentary written by Patrick Krill and Brett Thornton on where to go in the actually methane studies with respect to the IPCC process. And one thing that is really worth pointing out in this publication is that and what this publication actually highlights is that we are finding more and more carbon sources, important methane sources, in particular submarine permafrost is highlighted as one. And yet the top-down approaches that are based on atmospheric inventories, and these left and right panels, the T is the top-down TD and the BU is the bottom-up approach, actually show that the bottom-up approaches, the more new methane reservoirs we find, we don't meet the top-down approaches of the methane inventory in the atmosphere. And most importantly is that if one compares this record to the past 800,000 years that we have preserved in ice cores, there is a relatively narrow range of variation in methane concentration by only about a petagram. So the records suggest, even though we've gone through several glacial interglacial cycles of methane release, there's not that much room to release so much more new methane. So the bottom-up approaches, and my whole scaling discussion that I had before applies to the methane problem as well. We need to find better parameters for the bottom-up scaling in order to match the top-down observation much, much better. And only when that is really possible, we can actually try to understand these individual sources and sinks. So with that, I want to give the room to our three speakers that we have asked to give us presentation. The first one will be Juri Palmtag. He will be on the methane side, on cryoturbation and permafrost carbon. Then it will be followed by two talks on the marine realm, one that is actually on methane gas hydrates, and one will be by Filippa Fransner on non-Redfieldian stoichiometry. So looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Volker. Still, I think there's room for maybe one or two questions, although it's not Volker's personally work, but maybe already we have something, maybe something to discuss. So if you have, of course, please ask questions. Otherwise, we go ahead with Juri's presentation about cryoturbation. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and yeah, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I got the opportunity to talk about cryoturbation and then the action with the carbon cycle. I started actually to explain actually what cryoturbation is, because it's actually a very wide definition for it. So a second, I'm just have to, yes. So by Bockheim, once upon a time, it's a major soil forming process which refers to all freezing and thawing movements, which then also leads to the migration of organic rich topsoil horizons into deeper layers. And of course, particularly important at the higher latitudes. And I've actually photographed more or less how it looks, or can look in reality. So what we see here actually that due to freezing soil, which is of course happening annually, so every spring and autumn, which is freezing, and then actually going again, we have actually movement of organic material into deeper layers. This actually is a permafrost layer, you can see here. And these pockets, you can see in the color, they're sometimes actually not degraded at all, so can actually be very labile. And this can of course happen several times. This is a cross section, as you can see here. So more or less, you have the active layer, the permafrost layer, as JJ is defined actually as cryoturbation, and you can see actually these carbon-rich pockets actually can appear in several locations, which means actually this is something which is happening again and again. So it's not just like maybe once. And well, but it's also different cryoturbation, let's say. There's also, what we see here, so repeated thawing and freezing can also cause this very nice distributed pattern ground, stone circles, mud boils, also polygonal ground. And we'll have, for example, the stone circles. With the freezing, we actually have a uplift of the coarser material of the stones, let's say, while the volume below would actually filled up with the finer texture. And this, of course, on an annual basis is causing that actually all the bigger stones actually ending up and can create these circles. But also another cryoturbation, which by definition is also like slope movement, which can create these alluvial tarns, where we have actually, when we have actually the thawing actually and the whole active layer detachment can actually loosen up and move down. And then we have actually, in this case, we don't have pockets, we have actually layers, which can also be carbon rich. But this material is then, compared to these pockets, relatively degraded because it was exposed to aerial decomposition over a longer period of time. And then more or less it was gradually buried. So actually we have to distinguish these ones. Okay, but why cryoturbation? Why is it important? So there are two actually processes. So first of all, you have the subduction of this top-rich organic material, and of course, once actually it's below ground, the conditions are much colder and wetter, and then of course it's causing unfavorable conditions for microbial decomposition. So it's actually delaying anything. So it's becoming more or less accumulative, like a storage. But also by actually removing the organic layer, we're actually giving the possibility to create a new organic layer. So there is two things actually which are causing increased carbon storage in these higher latitudes. And from several sites which we have, for example, in Russia, more or less just to give the size, about 30%, if you look at the top meter of the carbon, was actually part in these cryoturbed pockets. We talk about 30%, substantial amount. And if we assume like the database hosted by the Bolin Center, we have 500 petagrams carbon in the top meter. So we talk about 150 petagrams only due to cryoturbation. So a substantial amount. And here we actually look at CN ratios as a proxy for the decomposition. And so the idea is more or less, we know, higher the CN ratio, for example, less decomposed. So this actually is a organic layer, and you can imagine it's not decomposed. Interesting here is what we see that the cryoturbed material is significantly less, higher CN levels, and actually less decomposed than the surrounded mineral material next to it. Also, when we look actually in this graph, you see we dated several samples. It's only from one pattern, and we see clearly that cryoturbation is something which is occurring, yeah, again and again. So these pockets have really different ages, and it's actually not fixed, let's say. The question is, of course, which is also done now, is it something actually which doesn't happen anymore when it's warmer or colder? This is still, I think, ongoing work. Yes. This is actually what is part of the Bolin database, the map from Hogelius. Once again, we talk about the area, the top meter, which is about 500 petagrams, and you see the substantial differences in the carbon storage in the top meter. And once again, it can be actually about 150 petagrams actually are just there because of cryoturbation, which makes this process really important. And yeah, to note maybe, so this area actually covers only 16% of the global soil area, so it's a really minor area, which stores a lot of carbon. And here are a few sites where I was working, Northeast Russia, Crimea Peninsula, and Greenland. See actually the very different landscapes. You have these kind of uplands, and then you have yeah, these polygonal structures, floodplains, and the mountainous sites. They're all very different. But nevertheless, we could find everywhere signs of cryoturbation, while in Greenland, actually the proportion was, let's say, less, but also due to different things. We have different processes occurring there. And actually, then we had the idea to look on a soil texture. So we tried to correlate the soil texture in cryoturbated material and see if there's actually, yeah, if we can see something. So these are actually two graphs from two sites about 100 kilometers apart. You can see one side in Crimea Peninsula, one side is more sandy, while the other side is more silty. And these actually the mean from non-cryoturbated samples. And then actually when we looked at the samples which were cryoturbated, actually we saw something actually which was really funny, because all the cryoturbated samples actually had a different soil texture. Actually, they were more coarse-grained, let's say, between coarse silt and very fine sand. And then we expanded actually the analysis on 2 more Russian sites to see, and this was the result. So these actually 4 Russian sites, Northeast Siberia and Crimea Peninsula, and this is only where we actually saw signs of cryoturbation. And all these samples actually were in the spectrum of very fine sand, yeah, very coarse silt to very fine sand maximum. So now, of course, the question, I'm not, if this is the case, so this study has to be expanded, but I mean, this is actually, I think, fascinating result. To see actually, if this is the case, actually we could use this to more or less to hotspot actually areas to see actually, okay, so it's actually, if we have these coarser materials, doesn't mean actually we have actually more carbon, more cryoturbation going on. And of course, with this, we could also actually, let's say, reduce uncertainties, actually, which we still have, which are quite huge on a northern circumpolar scale. And the next step, actually, also maybe just apart from the soil texture, also to look how the vegetation actually affects the burial mechanisms, also different rooting types, how they have, because actually this is something which can also be affected. So I mean, this is actually now ongoing work, and yeah, and this paper is now in review. Yeah, that's from me.
Thank you very much, Juri, for this interesting talk about cryoturbation and some first results. Any questions to you, Juri? Please use the microphone.
This isn't my area, so I'm a little lost. How much enriched are the coarse grain-sized area permafrost areas that you're looking at compared to other areas? And what areas are you comparing it to? Where is there?
We didn't compare areas, we compared more or less sites or samples with each other. So, you know, as I saw before in the profile, some samples were not. I mean, we have actually these cryoturbate pockets and non-cryoturbate materials. Actually, we compare materials often with the same pattern to each other. But of course, also, I mean, this study is based, I mean, what we saw about 170 samples in total, 4 studies. So we tried more or less to pinpoint, which were cryotubated, which we defined them being at least twice as much carbon as the surrounding materials.
And it's this subducted topsoils that have that grain size profile.
Exactly. We didn't take into account, we removed actually all the organic layers. We just did not mix up. So we really looked at mineral samples, and the mineral samples actually which are enriched with sea by cryotubation.
There's one more question from Anders.
What is the time horizon for this process, transporting carbon down?
This was actually, I think it's also depending where you are. But I mean, what we saw, for example, in the site in Chersky in northeast Russia. So actually, we actually have here data between actually 3,500 to 10,000. So this perturbation is actually ongoing, and they all, I mean, what we see actually, they're all very carbon rich, and also, I mean, in many cases, actually, these pockets you can still actually see some remains from vegetation, so really low decomposed. So actually, but this is something which is ongoing. But it's also, it differs between site to site.
But what kind of magnitude? 10 years, 100 years?
For?
Well, I mean, sort of the time to transport material from, let's say, from the top and 1 or 2 meters down. What kind of time?
I think, I mean, that also depends on the active layer depth. I mean, of course, it's very hard to move it beyond into permafrost. So this actually maybe just freeze in. But I think actually it takes. But I'm talking about. I think I mean to some extent it's centuries at least. So it's not centuries. So it's not something which is happening over a few decades. But also it depends on the vegetation. So, for example, on the side in the picture I showed, where it's a whole tussock buried in. So this is something which of course takes time, because I mean it's a whole tussock with the rooting system. It is relatively slow if it's a huge, vegetative bunch. While I think maybe smaller particles actually also move down relatively quick by considering water and so on.
This is a really good question. So this is the active kind of research that we are trying to do also with the dating. So if you look into these dates, then it seems like it takes a long time, but it could also be like it was a fast process during 1 year or 2 years, but then sitting for some thousand years there. So that was also my question actually. And my question would be, do you know data about modern cryotubated material? Because when I look into the literature, I always see these thousands of years old cryotubated material, but do you find also data with modern?
I mean, we didn't date so much because of the prices, but I think if you look on this one, I mean, you have actually cryotubated material which is relatively high up, close to the horizon. Of course, this material is also already below, so and it is much younger. But then, of course, you have the problem actually when you date actually. What do you date, in fact? I mean, do you date actually still maybe the roots from above? So it gets a bit more tricky. But I think actually something still which is ongoing and can be relatively young, much younger than we saw 3,500.
Okay, thank you very much, Juri. So we need to move on to the next presentation, which is by Christian Stranne.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about modeling of seafloor methane gas escape as a consequence of model climate warming and something called hydrate dissociation. And for those of you who don't know what hydrate is, it's shown here. It's an ice-like compound, and you can actually light it on fire. It consists of water molecules and mostly methane. I'm assuming pure methane in my modeling, but you would also have traces of propane and ethane in this. Contributed to this work, Matt O'Regan, Martin Jacobson, and Jared Dickens have all done a lot of work with within this project. So the main concern with the hydrates is that natural hydrates would, in a warming climate, at least partly would melt. And we call it dissociate. And so then you have water forming, but more importantly, you would have methane gas forming within the sediments. And this gas can, in worst case scenario, end up in large quantities within into the atmosphere, where it could actually reinforce climate warming. So it's a real threat, and a lot of research has been focusing on this problem over the last decades. You could say that the modeling community, hybrid modeling community, is divided into two sub-communities. You have the oil and gas industry people that are trying to find ways to extract gas from these deposits. And then you have the climate researchers that are looking into stuff that I'm going to present here. And traditionally, the oil and gas scientists would use very complex numerical models, while the climate scientists would tend to use these very simple approaches. And I'm somewhere in between, using the more complex models for looking at climate-related questions. So traditionally, as I said, the climate researchers have used this I call it the hydrostability approach, and it's all the available estimates of future gas release from the seafloors are based on this simple approach. And it's just simply using the fact that the hydrostability is a function of pressure, salinity, and temperature, and then you can calculate the volume of the stability zone shown here. It would look typically like this gray zone here. And then you just assume that this zone is homogeneously occupied by some saturation of hydrates. And then it's very easy to calculate the change in volume for a given perturbation in temperature on the seafloor. And then you just assume that all the stabilized volume of hydrates would be converted into gas and instantaneously released into the ocean. So I'm using another more complex numerical model, and it handles stuff that is not taken into consideration in this simpler approach. It handles pressure, salinity changes, endothermic dissociation reaction. I'll say something more about that. Changes in bulk conductivity and relative permeability. All these things are important. Geomechanical coupling is also something that it's not in the original version of this code. So that's something that I've been working really hard on over the last year. And also there's no methane oxidation within this model. But if we return to this simple approach, so it was very natural for me when I started to use this more complex model to compare with this simpler approach and see how well it does. And we identified 3 critical problems with this simple approach. And one of them is sediment gas retention. So all the gas that is produced within the sediments when hydrates are melting it's not instantaneously released, which is the assumption in the simpler approach. But it takes time for the gas to travel through the sediments. And so basically, after 100, 200 years, we will still have something like 40, 50, sometimes 60, 70% of the produced gas still within the sediments. So that's very important to take into consideration. And another thing is the endothermic dissociation reaction, which is very important. I will show you on the next slide just how important it is. It's not taken into consideration either, and this is basically just the dissociation reaction itself consumes heat. It slows down the dissociation reaction. And then there's a negative pressure gas formation feedback, which is of less importance, but it's far from negligible. And it's basically just when you have gas forming, the pressure increases within the sediments, and that leads to stabilization of the system. Slows down the dissociation rate also. So just a few examples from GRL 2016 paper where we did some comparisons. So here we are assuming a 3 degrees warming over 100 years on the seafloor. So for a shallow hydrate deposit sitting fairly high up on the shelf slope, It would take 5 years to get rid of it, basically, with this simpler approach, and 75 years using the toughness hydrate. And most of this effect is the endothermic dissociation reaction, which is not taken into consideration. Another example, if we go a little bit further down on the shelf slope, where we initially have a 100-meter thick hydrate deposit, it would, we would have, after 100 years, 340 kilos per square meter of gas coming out using the simpler approach, and about 5 kilos using the toughness hydrate. So there are problems both in terms of timing and quantities with this simpler approach. Another problem is the assumption that the hydrates are homogeneously distributed within the sediments. And this dawned on me when I was on the Spheres cruise. Colleagues were talking about sea level changes, and basically they explained to me that during the last glacial maximum, 22,000 years ago, the sea levels, relative sea levels in the Arctic on the East Siberian shelf was 120 meters lower than present day. And I realized that this must have had an effect on the distribution of hydrates. So if this red triangle here is the present day stability zone, it would have looked something like this during the last glacial maximum. So any hydrates that were sitting in the depleted zone, this gray triangle here, must have been depleted during that period of time. And so we used the formation rate presented by Klaus Wollmann and his colleagues at Giromar in Germany, and we actually doubled the formation rate to calculate how much has accumulated in this depleted zone since over the last 20,000 years. So we put that number into this gray triangle. It's actually a small number because normally it would take hundreds of thousands of years for these deposits to build up. And basically, if we just assume the normal homogeneously distributed situation, we get 0.35 gigatons coming out from the East Siberian shelf slope during the first 100 years. When this is taken into consideration, it ends up being something like 0.05. So there's a huge difference here. And the reason is because most of the action is at the edge of stability, you could say. So that's, and though much of those sediments are already depleted. So that's also something to consider, I think, when we try to make these large-scale estimates of future gas release. Okay, so I mentioned that there's no geomechanical coupling to this original version of the code, and that's something I've been working on. In the GRL 2016 paper, we actually did not... Okay, so basically, when we have low permeabilities, all these panels here show permeability on the x-axis. And basically, we just said that we have no idea what is happening in low permeability sediments. We were only talking about what is happening, the dynamics of high permeability sediments in this paper. And it's because of the low restricted gas mobility. When gas is forming, it can't go anywhere, and so pressure builds up to unrealistically high levels. But then recently we managed to develop a fracture module that is now fully coupled with this toughness hydrate model. So now we can start to look at what is happening in low permeability sediments. I wish I had more time, but just as an example, this top panel here is showing the cumulative gas release, and the solid lines is with the fully coupled model run, and the dashed is the original version of the code. You see that if you look at the solid lines here, that we actually get more gas coming out of the system in low permeability sediments than in high permeability sediments. This is interesting, at least I think so. Another very intriguing thing here is the non-linearity of gas release when we use this fully coupled system. You can see here on the top panel, now we have time in days on the x-axis rather than years, and gas flux. You can see these spikes in gas release. We have these bursts of bubbles coming out. And this is actually what it looks like when you go to real hydrate systems and look at the seepage. It looks something like this. So this is, we think we're onto something here, and we're quite intrigued by this. So I just recently got funding to go to Ocean Networks Canada to set up this model for the Cascadia margin, the hydrate ridge there. So that's in this spring. You can also see the distribution of fractures here with time and depth below seafloor. Okay, another thing we're working on right now is to include an oxidation module into this code. And this is actually important. All the stuff I've shown so far hasn't included any oxidation. But it has been shown that something like 90% of the methane that is coming up through the sediment would be oxidized. So this needs to be included in the model, I think. And we think that probably it will depend a bit on how the gas is traveling through the sediments. If it's percolating through high permeability sediments, there will be plenty of time for the methane to oxidize, while if it's going through rapidly opening of fractures and rapid gas release, there will be less important, this oxidation. So this is an ongoing collaboration. Volker Brüchert is in on this, and also Jerry Dickens will be involved. He seemed enthusiastic at least. And it's actually already up and running. And of course, it's super intriguing, the initial results. So just a few concluding remarks. We basically have to update the available estimates of future gas release need to be updated. And I think a key parameter here is the permeability. It depends a lot on what permeability the sediments have. And hydraulic fracturing, oxidation. It's tricky, but we have to include it in these models. So that's all I had. I have to at least try to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We have time for questions. You can take my micro.
Yeah, thank you. First, a remark. It's very interesting. The reduction in the rate of release is really quite important because even if there's no oxidation inside the ocean or sediments itself, if you release 0.05 gigatons of methane over 100 years, most of that is going to be converted to CO2 in the atmosphere anyway. And 0.05 gigatons of CO2 is just not a big deal compared to anthropogenic emissions. So
I'd say most of it would be oxidized within the ocean column.
that's even before it gets a chance to get into the, but anything that gets out. So even if you had an order of magnitude more methane released, once you oxidize some of that in the ocean and the rest of it is oxidized over 10 years or so in the atmosphere, it's not going to have much of a climate effect because it's turned into CO2. But the question is whether the oxidation in the sediments might actually substantially reduce the amount of clathrates formed in the first place, because you have the same methanotrophs and working in the sediments when the clathrates are being formed, so that a lot of those clathrate stable zones might not be full of clathrates at all. I was wondering if the oxidation is fully taken into account when you're estimating how much clathrates are there to begin with.
Well, the simple approach that we are applying here is just assume that there is a depleted zone. So you have a sulfate reduction zone, and it's in this original version of the code, I would just say that there's no clathrates in the top 5-6 meters.
Right, but when the
basically
clathrates were forming, some of those clathrates were forming closer to the oxidation zone. So I'm arguing maybe those clathrates never formed in the first place because they were oxidized before they ever got to turn into clathrates.
Yes, but deeper down in the sediments, you would still have formation of hydrates, right?
Maybe you can discuss
Yeah.
coffee break. We have one more question.
Yeah, those complex oil gas industry models, do they have all the effects that you're talking about here?
No, that's what I'm using. I'm using one of the more complex models around. Yeah, it's developed for that reason.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Christian, for your interesting talk, and we need to move on to our last talk from Filippa Fransner. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Filippa Fransner and I'm a PhD student at NISU, and I'm going to present this work which is called Non-Redfieldian Dynamics Explain PCO2 Drawdown in the Gulf of Bothnia. And this is about marine primary production. That is when phytoplankton fix inorganic carbon into biomass. And when they do so, the inorganic carbon concentration in the water decrease, and we get this drop in PCO2, and that's what we call PCO2 drawdown. I want to start with this global satellite estimate of primary production. And from this estimate, you see that a lot of things are happening in the coastal seas. In the Baltic Sea is an interesting sea to study because we have a lot of research and a lot of monitoring. And in the Gulf of Bothnia, this northern part, we have had some problems in understanding the primary production. Here's an example from a model where they don't manage to model the PCO2 drawdown in summer. And similarly, they have problems to model the nutrient dynamics. So there is too much phosphorus and they don't get down to nitrogen. When we model primary production, most models, both in the Baltic Sea and global marine biogeochemical models, model the carbon uptake as a function of the uptake of limiting nutrients, which in the Baltic Sea is nitrogen and phosphorus. They are related to each other by the Redfield ratio that Bolin explained yesterday, where you relate carbon to nitrogen, phosphorus, with this 106 to 16 to 1. But in reality, this relation can vary quite a lot. This is numbers I found in the literature. So the carbon to phosphorus can be as large as 1,000, and the carbon to nitrogen can go up to 300. And especially during nutrient limitation, you can have a larger uptake of carbon compared to this. Yeah, if you use a fixed ratio. So what we investigate here is if we can reproduce the seasonal cycles of PCO2 and nutrients if we use a model with variable stoichiometry. And we want to know how it performs compared to a fixed stoichiometric model and how important this is for the carbon cycling. We use a 3D model, so for this problem we don't really need a 3D model, but it will be used for other studies in the future. And it's based on NEMO, and to this we have coupled BFM, the biogeochemical flux model, which models many things. It has 4 different kinds of phytoplankton, it has zooplankton, bacteria, organic matter of different lability, and then nutrients and the inorganic carbon system. We set up 2 simulations, one that we call FLEX, where the carbon to nitrogen and carbon to phosphorus ratios in the phytoplankton can vary, and then one simulation called FIXED, where we use the Redfield ratio. And here are the results. And we validate the model at the F9 station here, and the seafloor station in the Gulf of Bothnian Sea. At both stations, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, the most limiting nutrient. And you see that both the flex and the fix model manage quite well to simulate the phosphate cycle. If you look at the nitrogen, the fix doesn't manage at all at the F9 station. It does a little bit better at the C3 station, but it doesn't go all the way down. While the flex does quite well. Then if you go to PCO2, so we look at the PCO2 in the Bothnian Bay, which is the upper part, the northern quark, and the Bothnian Sea, which is the lower part there. And here you see that the flex simulation draws down the PCO2 to observed values, while the fix simulation in the Bothnian Bay, it doesn't work at all. In the northern quark and the Bothnian Sea, we get a drawdown for the primary production, but then it goes up. And why the flex does better than the fix can be explained in this figure. I won't go through it in detail, but what I want to show you is that the flex simulation deviates far from Redfield, which is this black line, for NP, CP, and CN ratios. And what's interesting is that if we compare this to measured primary production rates, so first just look at the annual estimate here. The flex simulation have a larger primary production compared to observations, while the fix seems to do better, and that's a bit strange. But then we dig into the literature, and we found that what this actually measures is the production of particulate organic carbon. And if we just look at the particulate organic carbon in the flex simulation, it seems to do rather well. And it's similar if you look at every month during the year. And this other thing, that's production of dissolved organic carbon. And if we compared to measured dissolved organic carbon at the two stations, it seems like the model captures the seasonal evolution of dissolved organic carbon, so it makes sense. And then at last, what about the effect on air-sea-CO2 exchange? We see that if we don't take into account the stoichiometric flexibility, the CO2 uptake from the atmosphere is reduced by half. It's quite a lot. So, we managed to simulate the observed PC2 and macronutrient dynamics by using variable stoichiometry. And if we don't take this into account, the CO2 uptake is reduced by half, and the model also suggests a more productive Gulf of Bothnia than measurements. I don't know how I did with time. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation. It was really interesting. We have time for some questions. Yeah, question.
Nice presentation. Oh, nice presentation. Thank you. I wonder how labile or stable this DOC is. So how long does it stay as DOC, or does it outgas or turn into CO2? What is that into your model?
Yeah.
That side of the equation.
Go back to. So the libel dome has a turnover rate of 1 day, and the semi-libel has a turnover rate of 1 month. And yeah, that's the one that is important for the seasonal accumulation of DOC.
I have actually a question to this nice results of flexible stoichiometry that you showed to these time series. So how do you derive these? Is this optimized estimates, or do you prescribe these, or?
No, that's dynamical, and it's based on, you have an optimal quota that is set to Redfield, and then you have upper and lower limits, and then that is modeled dependent on the uptake of nutrients and uptake of carbon, and it's quite complex.
So you optimize online to some observations? To fit observations?
No. The stoichiometry is completely dynamic, and the model does what it wants.
So you have a function to something. The stoichiometry is a function of something in the model. So you have an equation for that.
It's a function of the uptake of nutrients and carbon, and also the release of carbon.
Has that been published before, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can show you.
Okay. More questions from your side? Okay.
With the same regard, if you have primary producers that have N2P ratios in July of 150, what kind of, do they store all this nitrogen? This is far away from any biochemical stoichiometry that we know of.
Yeah. So the model, it predicts that the primary producers has this stoichiometry, but there are also other things that would be interesting to look at, like, for example, the uptake of organic nutrients that would reduce this extreme stoichiometry. We did some tests with that. But we need observations of stoichiometry to really know what's happening.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice presentation, and I would like to thank all the speakers for the session. It was really interesting.